The morning Michael left was no different from any other, or at least, it seemed that way to his wife. However, had a different plan. He had been awake long. The morning Michael left was no different from any other, or at least, it seemed that way to his wife, Clara, and their son, Ao. The sun peeked through the warm curtains of their small but cozy home in the heart of Lagos. Clara was in the kitchen, frying akara for breakfast. The soft sizzle of the oil was familiar, almost soothing, as she hummed a tune that Ao, still half asleep, heard from his room. Michael, however, had a different plan. He had been awake long before sunrise, pacing the length of their living room, his heart heavy with unspoken worries. The debts had piled up, one after the other, choking the life out of him. He had tried to find a solution, but each time he reached out for help, the door was slammed in his face. He had lost his job months ago but hadn't found the courage to tell Clara. Clara and Ao were everything to him, but as he packed a small bag that morning, his heart was already stilled with his decision. In his mind, he justified it as an act of mercy. He believed they would be better off without him. Clara wouldn't have to worry about his debts, and maybe they could find a way to survive without the dead weight he had become. When the clock hit 6 a.m., Michael walked out the front door, quietly locking it behind him. The only sound was the soft clinking of his keys as he dropped them into the mailbox, a final act of closure. He drove off in the family car, disappearing down the road, leaving behind everything he had once known. When Clara and Ao returned home that evening, everything seemed off. Clara opened the front door, only to be greeted by an eerie silence. The house, which once held the warmth of their family, felt cold and abandoned. As they stepped inside, Clara's eyes widened in disbelief. The living room was empty. The couch where Ao usually watched TV was gone. The dining table, the pictures on the wall, the curtains, all of it was gone. Ao, stay outside for a moment, Clara whispered, her voice shaking. Ao, sensing his mother's fear, complied, standing at the doorstep. Clara walked through the house in a daze. The bedrooms were stripped bare, the kitchen empty. She stood in the center of what used to be their life, her breath quickening as the realization hit her. Michael had left them. She collapsed on the floor, her hands trembling as tears streamed down her face. Ao, still standing outside, peeked in and saw his mother in a state of despair. Without thinking, he ran to her, his small arms wrapping around her shoulders. Mom, what happened? Where's Dad? Ao's voice was laced with confusion. Clara couldn't answer. She just held him, clutching him tightly as if her embrace could shield him from the cold truth that was now their reality. Days turned into weeks. Clara tried to put on a brave face for Ao, but the weight of Michael's abandonment crushed her spirit. They couldn't afford to stay in the house for long. Michael had left them with no money, no savings, no way to pay the rent. Soon, the landlord came knocking, and Clara knew their time was up. Clara packed what little they had left, and they moved out of the only home Ao had ever known. With nowhere to go, they wandered the streets. Each night, they found a different corner to sleep in, but the cold, hard pavement offered little comfort. Clara made sure Ao ate before she did, though the scraps of food she managed to beg from strangers were barely enough to fill their bellies. Ao, who had always been a lively child, became quiet and withdrawn. His laughter, once the soundtrack of their home, had been replaced by the hollow silence of hunger and fear. Clara noticed the change in him and it broke her heart. But what could she do? With no job and no prospects, she felt helpless. One evening, as Clara sat on a bench in a local park, an old neighbor named Mr. Taiwo approached her. He had heard of their plight and took pity on them. He was a tall man in his 60s, with a kind face and a reputation for being helpful. Clara thought of him as a lifeline, someone who could offer a solution. "Clara, I may have a job for you," Mr. Taiwo said gently. His tone was sympathetic, but there was something behind his eyes, something Clara couldn't quite place. Clara's heart leapt at the prospect of a job. A way to earn money and get back on her feet. "Really? What kind of job?" she asked eagerly. "Well, it's unconventional. But it pays well," Mr. Taiwo said hesitantly, avoiding eye contact. Desperation had dulled Clara's instincts, and she didn't question it. She simply followed Mr. Taiwo, hoping this would be the break she needed. The small clinic they entered didn't look like a place for legitimate work. The air was sterile, and the walls were painted an unsettling shade of white. Clara felt a knot tighten in her stomach as they entered, but she forced herself to remain hopeful. Inside, they were met by a doctor who explained the job, an opportunity to sell one of her kidneys for 500,000 naira. Clara's heart sank, and her blood ran cold. The doctor spoke casually, as if this was a common transaction. "It's a simple procedure. You'll be compensated well, and you'll save someone's life." Clara recoiled in horror. Was this what she had been reduced to? Selling her own body to survive? At first, Clara refused outright. She stormed out of the clinic, tears streaming down her face as she clutched Eo's hand tightly. But as the weeks dragged on, their situation grew even more dire. Eo had to stop attending school. Clara could see the sadness in his eyes every time they passed by his classmates in their uniforms. He had been a bright student, always at the top of his class, but now his future seemed uncertain. She watched her son wither away under the weight of their suffering. It was in these darkest moments that Clara realized she had no choice. She had to do whatever it took to give Eo a future, even if it meant sacrificing a part of herself. With a heavy heart, Clara returned to the clinic. She signed the papers and prepared herself for the surgery. The day before the operation, she held Eo close, her mind racing with fears of what could go wrong. But in her heart, she knew this was the only way. The surgery was a success. Clara woke up in a sterile room, weak and groggy, but alive. Beside her was an envelope containing 500,000 naira, more money than she had ever seen in her life. She held it in her trembling hands, knowing the price she had paid. With the money, Clara rented a small apartment and used the rest to open a modest business selling provisions at the local market. She poured all of her energy into the business, working from dawn till dusk, determined to build a stable life for herself and Eo. Slowly but surely, their lives began to improve. Eo was able to return to school, and Clara's business grew, allowing them to move from barely surviving to living with a sense of security they hadn't felt in years. Eo, seeing his mother's sacrifice, became even more determined to succeed. He studied hard and eventually graduated from university with honors. His success filled Clara's heart with pride. Her sacrifice had not been in vain. As Eo grew older, his relationship with his mother remained strong. He never forgot what she had done for him, and he made sure to take care of her in return. When he got his first job, he bought Clara a new house, a beautiful home in a quiet neighborhood where she could finally rest after years of hardship. But as Eo's life flourished, a new figure entered their world, Chika, a beautiful and ambitious woman whom Eo had fallen in love with. At first, Clara was happy for her son. Chika seemed like a good match. But soon, cracks began to appear in the relationship. Chika was jealous of the close bond Eo shared with his mother. She couldn't understand why Eo was so devoted to Clara, always putting her first. Chika wanted all of Eo's attention, and she resented the fact that he would drop everything to care for his mother. Initially, Chika tried to mask her displeasure. She would make passive-aggressive comments about Clara's influence on Eo. "You know, Eo, sometimes I wonder if your mother's influence is holding you back," she'd say, her voice laced with subtle criticism. But as time went on, Chika's attempts to break their bond grew more overt. She began to demand more financial support from Eo. She insisted that he prioritize her needs over his mother's. "I need more money for our wedding plans, Eo. We can't keep postponing things because of your mother's needs," Chika would argue. Eo was torn between his love for Chika and his sense of duty to Clara. He tried to balance both, but Chika's demands became more insistent. She would orchestrate scenarios where Eo had to choose between spending time with Clara or fulfilling her demands. One evening, Chika invited Eo to a fancy dinner, insisting he leave Clara alone at home. When Eo hesitated, saying he wanted to spend the evening with his mother, Chika's frustration boiled over. "Every time we try to have a special moment, your mother comes first. Do you even realize how unfair this is to us?" she snapped. Eo was taken aback. He had never seen this side of Chika before. He tried to explain that Clara had sacrificed so much for him and that he couldn't just ignore her needs. But Chika wouldn't hear it. She accused him of being selfish and manipulative, and the argument ended with Chika storming out of the house. Over the following weeks, Chika's attempts to drive a wedge between Eo and Clara became more aggressive. She started creating petty conflicts, criticizing Clara for every little thing. She would complain about Clara's cooking, her house, and even her way of speaking. Chika subtly undermined Eo's respect and love for his mother, planting seeds of doubt about her intentions and character. One day, Chika went as far as to make a scene during a family dinner. She arrived at Eo's apartment unannounced and found Clara preparing a meal. Chika, visibly irate, accused Clara of trying to control Eo's life. "I'm tired of playing second fiddle to your mother's whims," she declared loudly. "Why do you let her dictate our lives?" The dinner turned into a heated argument. Eo, caught between the two women he cared about, tried to calm the situation but found himself growing increasingly frustrated. He couldn't understand how Chika could be so cruel, especially after everything Clara had done for them. The tension in the room was palpable, and Clara's eyes were filled with hurt. After that night, the relationship between Chika and Clara became even more strained. Clara withdrew into herself, refusing to engage with Chika. She spent most of her time alone, focusing on her business and avoiding any unnecessary interactions. Eo was devastated, feeling like he was losing both the woman he loved and the mother who had sacrificed so much for him. Despite the growing tension, Eo still tried to maintain a balance. He would visit his mother regularly, though the visits were often marked by uncomfortable silence and strained conversations. Clara tried to put on a brave face, but her sadness was evident. She missed the days when their family was whole and peaceful. One fateful evening, Chika made a final, drastic attempt to sever the bond between Eo and Clara. She confronted Eo with an ultimatum. "It's either me or her," she said, her voice cold and resolute. "If you can't choose me, then I'm done." Eo's heart was torn apart by Chika's demand. He loved her deeply, but the thought of abandoning his mother was unbearable. He took a long, painful look at his life and realized that he was being forced into a position where he had to choose between two people who mattered deeply to him. In a moment of clarity, Eo made his decision. He chose to stand by his mother. He explained to Chika that his loyalty to Clara wasn't negotiable. He couldn't abandon the person who had given up everything for him, who had been his rock through all of life's hardships. Chika's reaction was explosive. She yelled, threw things around, and stormed out of Eo's life, leaving him to deal with the wreckage of their relationship. The decision was painful, but Ao felt a sense of relief. He had made the right choice, even though it meant losing someone he thought he could spend his life with. After Chika left, Ao and Clara's relationship began to heal. They spent more time together, and the bond between them grew stronger. Ao supported Clara's business, helping her with finances and marketing. Clara, in turn, found solace in seeing her son flourish and succeed. Their lives were not perfect, but they were theirs. Clara's sacrifices had not been in vain. Ao went on to achieve great success in his career, and Clara continued to be a source of strength and wisdom in his life. Their home was filled with laughter again, and their hearts were mended by the trials they had overcome. Years later, as Ao looked back on the challenges they had faced, he knew that their story was one of love, sacrifice, and resilience. Michael, who had left in the early days of their hardship, never returned. But Ao and Clara had found their own way to rebuild their lives, one step at a time. They learned that true family bonds are forged through trials and that love, no matter how tested, could endure. And so, their story became one of hope, a testament to the strength of a mother's love and a son's unwavering commitment to the one who had always been there for him. As the years passed, life for Clara and Ao settled into a routine. Clara's business continued to thrive, and Ao's career was flourishing. They had rebuilt their lives from the ground up, learning to find joy and fulfillment despite the hardships they had endured. Their bond was unbreakable, strengthened by the trials they had faced together. One afternoon, while Clara was walking in her shop, a familiar face appeared at the door. It was Michael. His appearance was a stark contrast to the man who had left them years ago. His once vibrant face was now lined with age and regret. Clara's heart sank as she saw him, and her mind raced with memories of the pain he had caused. Michael approached Clara with a hesitant step, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and apprehension. "Clara," he began softly, "I know it's been a long time, and I don't expect anything from you. I just needed to come back and try to explain." Clara looked at him, her emotions a whirlwind of anger and confusion. "Why now, Michael? After everything that's happened, why come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "I came back because I've been living with this guilt for so long." Heart pounding. "I thought leaving you and Ao would protect you from my failures. I was overwhelmed with debt and shame. But I see now how wrong I was. I lost my job and couldn't tell you why I left the truth to try to find some form of closure. I thought you'd be better off without me, that my absence would somehow make things easier for you. But I was wrong. I didn't realize how much I was hurting you by abandoning you." Tears welled up in Michael's eyes as he spoke. "I've tried to make sense of my actions, but nothing can undo the pain I caused. I've come to terms with the fact that I can't make things right, but I wanted you to know that I am truly sorry. I've been living with this regret, and I needed to ask for your forgiveness." Clara stood in silence, the weight of Michael's words crashing over her. The years of hardship, the nights of worry, and the sacrifices she had made for Ao all rushed back. She had built a new life, one that didn't include Michael, and she had come to accept that. Ao arrived shortly after, his expression a mix of curiosity and apprehension. When he saw Michael, he felt a familiar surge of anger and hurt. The man who had left them in their darkest hour was standing before him, seeking forgiveness that seemed impossible to grant. Michael's eyes met Ao's with a deep sorrow. "Ao, I know I can never make up for what I've done. I've seen the success you've achieved, and I'm proud of you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to tell you how sorry I am." Ao's anger flared, and he struggled to find the right words. "You can't just come back after all these years and expect everything to be okay. You abandoned us when we needed you most. You caused so much pain and suffering. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that." Michael nodded, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "I understand. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted to make sure you know that I am truly sorry for everything. I'll leave you to your lives. I hope you can find peace." With those final words, Michael turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. Clara and Ao watched him leave, the finality of the moment settling heavily on their hearts. In the days that followed, Clara and Ao struggled with the emotions stirred by Michael's visit. They found themselves reflecting on the pain of the past and the strength they had gained from it. The bitterness that had lingered began to dissipate, replaced by a deeper understanding of their own resilience. Clara and Ao continued to move forward, focusing on the lives they had built together. The pain of Michael's departure remained a part of their history, but it no longer defined them. They found solace in the strength of their bond and the love they shared. They made peace with the past, acknowledging the hurt but also recognizing the growth that had come from it. Michael's return had brought closure, allowing them to finally let go of the anger and resentment that had held them back. As they sat together, reflecting on their journey, Clara and Ao knew that their story was one of survival and strength. They had faced the storm and emerged stronger, their lives enriched by the love and sacrifices that had shaped them. The past was behind them, and they looked to the future with hope and determination. Their lives were no longer defined by the pain of abandonment, but by the love and resilience that had carried them through. They had found their peace, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose and happiness. Rachel stands in the living room, staring out of the window at the rising sun over the Abuja skyline. The city is already waking up, cars honking, pedestrians hurrying by, and the sounds of street vendors filling the air. She grips the windowsill, feeling a dull ache in her chest as another wave of fatigue washes over her. In the distance, she hears Stanley moving around, preparing for another long day at work. He enters the room, dressed in his crisp white shirt and blue tie, his phone already glued to his ear. He barely notices the paleness of her face, or the way she leans slightly against the wall for support. His mind is elsewhere. "Rachel, I'll be late again tonight. We have a huge meeting with the investors." "You know how it is," Stanley says as he gives her a peck on the cheek, eyes never leaving his phone screen. Rachel forces a smile. "Of course, I understand. But the truth is, she wishes he didn't have to work so much. She wishes he would see the weight she's been carrying alone." The cancer diagnosis had come a few months ago, shattering her world. Dr. Duke had urged her to tell Stanley, to lean on him for support, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Stanley was already so stressed with his projects, and Annabelle. Annabelle was so young, too young to understand what was happening to her mother. "I'll be fine," she had told herself over and over again. But with each passing day, the weight grew heavier, and her body weaker. Weeks turned into months, and the symptoms became harder to hide. Rachel often found herself too exhausted to cook or even play with Annabelle like she used to. Her once healthy, glowing skin now looked pale, and the bags under her eyes were growing darker. It was a Saturday morning, and the house was filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee. Annabelle sat at the dining table, coloring in her sketchbook, humming softly to herself. Stanley had gone out early to meet with a contractor, leaving Rachel and their daughter to spend the day together. Rachel stood in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she attempted to slice a loaf of bread. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her abdomen, causing her to drop the knife. She bent over, gripping the counter for support, her breath shallow. "Mommy." Annabelle's soft voice broke through the haze of pain. "I'm okay, darling," Rachel managed to say, straightening herself with great effort. She forced a smile as she walked over to her daughter, running a hand through Annabelle's curly hair. "Are you sick?" Annabelle asked, looking up at her with wide, concerned eyes. "No, sweetheart. Just tired." Tired? It was the same excuse she had given Stanley for months now, and every time he believed it. Or maybe he wanted to believe it because it was easier than acknowledging something was wrong. Later that day, Stanley came home, still buzzing from the success of his meeting. He swept Annabelle up in his arms, laughing and spinning her around as she squealed with delight. "Daddy! Look at the picture I drew today!" Annabelle exclaimed, running off to grab her sketchbook. Stanley turned to Rachel with a grin. "You should have seen the investors today. They were completely sold on the project. We are going to secure the funding, and once that happens, things will finally slow down." Rachel smiled weakly, watching as Annabelle returned with her drawing. She handed it to Stanley proudly, who held it up for both of them to see. The drawing depicted the family, Annabelle, Stanley, and Rachel standing in front of their home. But something was off. In the picture, Rachel was lying down on the grass, her eyes closed, while Stanley and Annabelle stood beside her, smiling. Stanley frowned slightly, glancing at his daughter. "Why is Mommy lying down in the drawing?" "Because she's tired all the time," Annabelle replied innocently, her big brown eyes full of concern. Stanley glanced at Rachel, his brows furrowing for a moment. "Are you sure you're okay? You do look a bit pale." "I'm fine," Rachel replied quickly, her voice light and dismissive. "I just need a little rest." And with that, the conversation was dropped, just like every other time Stanley had shown concern. Days turned into weeks, and Rachel's condition worsened. She could no longer hide the nausea, the dizzy spells, or the increasing bouts of pain. The worst part was the secret she carried. Each day, it grew heavier, threatening to break her. One particularly difficult morning, Rachel sat in the waiting room of Gaki Hospital, nervously twisting her wedding ring around her finger. She had come to see Dr. Duke for a routine checkup. She knew what he would say. It was time to tell Stanley. "Rachel," Dr. Duke's calm voice broke through her thoughts as he appeared in the doorway of his office. She rose to her feet and followed him inside. He studied her for a moment, concern etched into the lines of his face. "How are you feeling today?" "About the same," Rachel replied quietly, taking a seat. Dr. Duke glanced at the notes in his folder before setting them aside. "Rachel, I've said this before, but I'll say it again, you need to tell your husband. He deserves to know, and you deserve to have support during this time. You can't do this alone." Rachel looked down at her hands, her eyes welling with tears. "I don't want him to worry. Stanley, he's so busy with work. And Annabelle, she's just a child. I can't burden them with this." "You're not a burden," Dr. Duke said firmly. "Rachel, cancer is not something you can fight on your own. You need your family. Hiding this from them will only make things worse." Rachel wiped away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. She knew he was right, but the thought of telling Stanley terrified her. How would he react? Would he blame himself for not noticing sooner? "I'll think about it," Rachel said softly, though deep down, she knew it was a promise she might never keep. The weeks continued to pass, and Rachel's condition continued to deteriorate. She began losing weight rapidly, and there were days when even getting out of bed felt impossible. Yet, she continued to put on a brave face for Stanley and Annabelle. Stanley, in the meantime, remained preoccupied with work. The project was reaching its final stages, and the pressure from his clients was growing. He often stayed late at the office, leaving Rachel to manage things at home alone. One evening, as Stanley arrived home late again, he found Rachel asleep on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her frail body. She looked smaller, more fragile than ever before, and for the first time in months, Stanley felt a wave of deep concern wash over him. He gently shook her awake. Rachel. Rachel, wake up. Rachel stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She smiled weakly at him, though the effort seemed to drain her. Are you alright? Stanley asked, his voice soft but laced with worry. You don't look well. I'm fine, Rachel whispered, sitting up slowly. Just tired. Stanley studied her for a moment, the words of their daughter echoing in his mind. She's tired all the time. He had brushed off his own concerns for too long, but now, looking at her, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Rachel, you need to see a doctor. You haven't been yourself lately. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. The moment she had been dreading had arrived. She opened her mouth to tell him the truth, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she offered him a tired smile. I'll be fine. I just need some rest. Stanley hesitated, unsure whether to push the issue. But before he could say anything else, Rachel stood up, heading toward the bedroom. I'm going to bed, she said. Quietly. Stanley watched as Rachel disappeared into the bedroom, her frail figure moving slowly. Something in his gut twisted. She had been saying the same thing for months now, I'm just tired. But tired didn't explain the weight loss, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she seemed to be withering before his eyes. That night, as Stanley lay beside her in bed, he stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. His mind raced with questions and doubts. What if she was hiding something from him? He felt a cold sweat prick at his skin. But why would she? The next morning, Stanley resolved to press the issue further. After all, he couldn't let his wife's condition slip any further without knowing the truth. He went to work but couldn't focus. His thoughts kept drifting back to Rachel. Finally, around noon, he decided to call her. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. He frowned. She always picked up, especially when he called during the day. Something was wrong. Without thinking twice, Stanley left the office, driving home as fast as he could. His heart raced as he pulled into the driveway and rushed inside. Rachel, he called out, his voice echoing through the empty house. No answer. He sprinted up the stairs, fear clawing at his chest. When he reached their bedroom, he found her lying on the bed, pale and barely conscious. Rachel. Stanley rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he shook her gently. Her skin felt cold, and her breathing was shallow. I need to take you to the hospital, he said, his voice cracking with panic. Rachel's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him, her gaze filled with exhaustion. No. I'll be fine. No, you won't. Stanley shouted, the fear he'd been suppressing finally bursting out. Something is wrong, and I need to know what it is. You're not fine, Rachel. You're not. Tears streamed down Rachel's cheeks, and she shook her head weakly. I'm sorry. I didn't want to burden you. I didn't want to scare you. Stanley's heart ached as he cradled her in his arms. Please, just tell me what's wrong. I can't help you if you don't tell me. Rachel took a deep, shuddering breath before finally whispering the words she had been hiding for months. I have cancer, Stanley. I've had it for a while now. Stanley felt the ground fall away from beneath him. Cancer. The word hit him like a freight train. He pulled her closer, his eyes wide with disbelief. Why didn't you tell me? His voice was soft, almost a whisper. I didn't want you to worry, she said, her voice trembling. You've been so busy with work, and Annabelle. I didn't want her to know. I didn't want to take away her innocence. Stanley's chest tightened with guilt as tears filled his eyes. How had he not noticed? How had he let this slip through the cracks? I should have been there for you, he said, his voice breaking. I should have seen the signs. Rachel shook her head, her hand weakly resting on his cheek. You were always there, in your own way. But I made this choice. I thought I could handle it alone. Without wasting any more time, Stanley scooped Rachel into his arms and rushed her to Gaki Hospital. When they arrived, Dr. Duke was already waiting for them, having been informed by Stanley during the frantic drive over. Dr. Duke quickly assessed Rachel's condition and arranged for her to be admitted to the emergency ward. As they wheeled her away, Stanley held her hand tightly, refusing to let go until they reached the door to the operating room. I love you, Rachel whispered weakly, her eyes glassy with pain. Tell Annabelle, tell her that I love her. Stanley felt his throat tighten as he kissed her forehead. You tell her yourself, he said firmly, though he could hardly believe his own words. Hours passed, and Stanley sat in the waiting room, staring blankly at the clock. Annabelle was with a neighbor, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing around her. Stanley felt helpless, lost in a world where nothing made sense anymore. How had he let it get this far? How had he been so blind? Dr. Duke finally emerged, his face solemn. Stanley's heart dropped at the sight of him. Stanley, Dr. Duke began, his voice gentle but firm. Rachel's condition is critical. The cancer has spread too far. We are doing everything we can to make her comfortable, but there's not much time left. Stanley felt the words spin around him. Not much time left. How could that be? He had just found out. It wasn't fair. He had thought he still had time to fix things, to be there for her. You can see her now, Dr. Duke said softly. Stanley stood on shaky legs and followed the doctor into the room where Rachel lay. She looked so small, so fragile beneath the sterile white sheets, her once vibrant face now pale and gaunt. Stanley sat beside her, taking her hand in his. Rachel opened her eyes, her lips curving into a small, weak smile when she saw him. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Stanley shook his head, tears blurring his vision. Don't be. I'm the one who should be sorry. I should have been paying attention. I should have seen. Rachel squeezed his hand weakly. Don't. It's not your fault. I made my choice. Stanley's heart shattered as he leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. I love you, he whispered. I should have told you more often. I should have done more. But I love you, Rachel. I always have. Rachel's eyes fluttered shut, her breathing becoming more labored. Tell Annabelle to be brave, she murmured. And take care of her. She'll need you. Stanley nodded, his tears falling freely now. I promise. I'll take care of her. Rachel's breathing slowed, her chest rising and falling with great effort. Thank you for everything, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. And then, with one final exhale, Rachel was gone. Stanley sat in stunned silence, holding Rachel's lifeless hand in his. The room was unbearably quiet, save for the steady beep of the heart monitor that had flatlined minutes ago. His heart felt heavy, his chest tight with grief. How had this happened so fast? How had he missed the signs for so long? Stanley wiped his eyes as the nurse entered the room to begin the process of preparing Rachel's body. He kissed her forehead one last time, his heart aching with the weight of everything unsaid. When he left the hospital later that evening, the sun was setting over Abuja, casting the city in hues of orange and pink. Life moved on outside those hospital doors. The city continued to buzz, cars continued to honk, and people continued to live. But for Stanley, life had irrevocably changed. As he walked toward the car, Stanley paused and looked up at the sky. He thought of Annabelle, sweet, innocent Annabelle, who would come home from school tomorrow to find her world turned upside down. He would tell her. He would find the strength to be there for her in the way he hadn't been for Rachel. But for now, All he could do was mourn the loss of the woman he had loved but never truly understood, until it was too late.